Okay, so let me open the floor to questions. If you have any questions based on the video you just saw, please ask. Well, let me ask you a question or two then. Okay. What do they mean by a single member district system?
One representative, like one person representing the whole district.
Okay, so the jurisdiction, in this case, the city of Pasadena, they said was divided into 8 districts, right? And you have one person elected to represent each district on the city council, okay? And what they were proposing was changing this so that you eliminate a couple of these single member districts and replace them. Maybe now what they want to do is something like this, okay, where you have a fewer number of districts. I think they said 6, okay? Something like that, okay? And then 2 members of the council that would be elected at large. Okay, what does at large mean? Like all the voters in the city are going to elect those council members, like you would elect a mayor. Okay, a mayor is elected at large by all the voters in the city. Okay, but in a system of single member districts, you have council members who elect particular areas of the city. Okay, or who represent particular areas of the city. Now, what do they tell you about the distribution of the population in Pasadena? I mean, I'll put some numbers on the board there for you. Remember, they said 62% of Pasadena's population is Hispanic, or at least in 2013 is Hispanic, okay? But only about 32% of the voters are Hispanic, okay? And what else did they tell you? How the Hispanic and Anglo population is distributed in Pasadena? The more in the southern part of the state, right? So let's say under the original arrangement, you had, pretend those 8 districts are still up here, you had, say, 4 members of the council who were elected from the southern part of the city. So the likelihood is they're going to be Anglo, okay, right? But the likelihood is also that the representatives on the council from these districts up here are going to be Hispanic, right? I mean, let's face it, people have a tendency to vote for people who are like them, right? So why is that an argument? Why do the people who oppose the change in the system say that it's discriminatory? Because these 2 at-large members, these 2 proposed at-large members are very likely going to be what? They're very likely to be white, right? Because whites vote at a higher rate than Hispanics, okay? That's the basic argument and why they say it's discriminatory. Why did Pasadena propose this change in their system of representation when they proposed it? I mean, timing is kind of a critical factor here. Why did they do it when they did? Why did they put this issue on the ballot for voters at the time that they did it?
Because they wouldn't have to worry about the clearance.
In fact, you heard the mayor of the city say that, right? So the Justice Department can't tell us what to do anymore. And then you also heard former Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's now deceased, argue that this is the very kind of thing that the pre-clearance provision was designed to prevent. What she called second-generation discriminations. More, I think she would probably say, I don't think I'm speaking for her here. I think she's probably said this kind of thing when she spoke on it. A more subtle form of discrimination, right? A more nuanced form of discrimination, but nonetheless an effective form of discrimination was her view on it. Okay? Obviously, the majority of the court didn't agree with her. Okay? So I just want to make sure everybody's clear on that point, what the basic arguments are here. Okay, that, you know, why some people are going to argue that at-large representation is discriminatory, okay? Because it's very, very difficult for minorities under a system of at-large representation to get candidates that they want elected to office. And one response that some people make to that is, well, they should get out and vote more. Right? They have that power within their hands to get out and vote more. But I think the response to that other people make is that, well, the Constitution doesn't provide for equal protection of voters. It provides for equal protection of all persons. Right? And I think that's kind of the view that Ruth Bader Ginsburg made in her position as well, that the Constitution doesn't just protect the rights of voters, it protects the rights of persons, and they don't, not even citizens, right? Notice that the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution doesn't say that no state shall deny any citizen. It doesn't say no state shall deny any voter equal protection of the laws. It doesn't say no state shall deprive any citizen equal protection of the laws. It says no state shall deprive any person equal protection of laws. And you know why that language was framed like that? It was at the insistence of Southerners back at the time, at the original, when the original Constitution was written, that all persons be counted as part of the census, not citizens. You know, when the Constitution was written in 1787, conservatives, white conservatives in the South, wanted slaves to be counted for the purposes of enumeration of the population and representation in Congress, because that increased their population. If you count the slaves, that increases the population of Virginia. That increases the population of South Carolina, right? Relative to Pennsylvania, relative to New York. And that means that they have more say, more voices in Congress, okay? What they didn't anticipate was that insistence on persons and not citizens would come back to bite them, meaning conservative white Southerners would come back to bite them after, in the rear end, so to speak, after the Civil War, when the 14th Amendment was put into the Constitution, because it also says persons, right? It doesn't say citizens. So presumably, for example, people who argue that, when we take a census, we took a census supposedly in 2020, right? Took a while. I don't know that they finished it in 2020. I don't remember, but every 10 years we're supposed to take a census. And oftentimes a debate comes up about, well, who should we be counting anyway? Should we be counting undocumented people, illegal people? Well, they don't have any voice. They don't have any say, do they? Or they don't have any protections, do they? Well, apparently under the Constitution, yes, they do. Because they're persons, right? And a state like Texas or Arizona or whatever the state is can't deny equal protection of the laws to any person within their jurisdiction. Doesn't say citizen. Anyway, it's an interesting nuance that, sometimes is hard for people to understand. In light of what we're talking about here, though, I think the main point that I want you to understand is, how the system of at-large representation versus single-member districts, at least the arguments that it either favors or disfavors one group or another. Okay. Now, anybody curious how the vote came out? The vote in November 5th, on November 5th, did it say November 5th, 2013? The voters in Pasadena voted to approve the proposal to move to the, two new at-large positions. Okay. But what did we say, and they mentioned in the program, in the video as well, so we're now sort of back as a result of Shelby County versus Holder. By the way, Holder was the Attorney General of the United States, the head of the Justice Department during the Obama administration, okay? Responsible for enforcing the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance provision, okay? So when Shelby County wants to undo that law, they specifically file their case against the Attorney General. Okay? At any rate, the voters of Pasadena approved that. Okay, but because of Shelby County versus Holder, now we go back to the pre-clearance era. Okay, and what is the remedy for, in this case, Latinos if they believe they're being discriminated against? What's their remedy?
Through legal.
They have to go to court, okay? And there were court challenges filed by Hispanic voters in Pasadena, and ultimately they were settled, right? There was not a court, certainly didn't get to the United States Supreme Court, but there was no real court verdict. The city leaders and the Hispanic groups in Pasadena that filed the lawsuits came to a settlement. And I think it was something like, okay, just one new at-large position and, 7, I don't remember the exact numbers, but, like it was somewhere, it wasn't 2 new at-large members, it was like 1, and then, like retain an extra single member district. Okay. All right. So any questions about how Shelby County versus Holder affects these kinds of questions? Another example would be like things like photo ID laws. Okay. And I told this story in the Tuesday class. So some of you, if you've watched the video, you may remember this, but when Texas was one of the states back in 2010, 2011, where there was a real push to make to pass a law that requires voters to present a photo ID. Okay. Now that was before 2013. So presumably that would have had to been pre-cleared by the Department of Justice, right? In fact, the Department of Justice in the Obama administration refused to pre-clear. In fact, their holding was that it was discriminatory. Okay. But then along comes Shelby versus Holder. And what happens? Now those people who are pushing for photo ID laws in Texas, nothing's stopping us now, right? And they, of course, successfully passed the photo ID laws. Now there have been lawsuits, there have been challenges, and there actually have been court decisions. And the general drift of those court decisions is that Texas can have, or any state presumably can have a photo ID law, but they have to be a little bit more flexible about the kinds of ID that they will accept. Because originally under that photo ID laws that was passed by Texas back in 2013 or something like that, maybe 2015, I can't remember, but whenever the current law was passed, it only allowed like maybe 2 or 3 forms of ID, like a passport or a driver's license or a concealed gun permit. Right? And the courts said that that's too inflexible. You gotta have other ways to allow people who are otherwise entitled to vote, otherwise eligible to vote, but they don't have those forms of ID. You may have people living out in someplace in rural Texas who don't drive and who live 250 miles away from the closest DPS office, so it's not that easy as a practical matter for them to get the state issued ID card, right? So you're going to have to allow other options for voters, like maybe they don't have these forms of photo ID, but they can present maybe 2 utility bills or something like that that show their current address, that provide some evidence that they are who they say they are. All right, so any questions about any of that? We do need to shift gears and move on to a different, more general type of consideration, but I think these are important issues for us to at least touch on, like for you to come away from this class having some sense of what the arguments are with respect to these kinds of issues. Oops. What do I have it on right now? I thought I had it on, I guess I need to put it on this. There we go. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. A lot of things I really would like to be able to talk about with you, but I guess we just need to move on to other stuff. So let's talk a little bit about elections in Texas. We've talked a lot about voting now, so let's talk about elections. And I want to begin by distinguishing 2 different types of elections that we have in Texas. We have elections that are conducted on a partisan basis, partisan elections, and we have nonpartisan elections. By partisan elections, we mean where candidates run as nominees of political parties, And so you as a voter, when you go into the voting booth in Texas, for some offices, all offices at the state level and at the county level, federal offices like U.S. House of Representatives, U.S. Senate, and President, you're going to see the name of the candidate and the party that they are, who nominated them, okay? Nonpartisan elections are local elections in Texas, like municipal elections, city elections, like mayoral elections. So in Texas, the law doesn't permit candidates to run as nominees of political party in mayoral races or in city council races or school board races. That's what we mean. A school district is an example of a special district. Okay? But oftentimes voters in an area know. I don't really know much about Sugar Land, so I'm going to use Houston as an example. Okay? Anybody know who the mayor of Houston is? Sylvester Turner. Do you know if he's a Democrat or a Republican? He's a Democrat, right? And everybody knows that. Okay? There's no secret to that. Okay? You can bet voters in Houston, most voters in Houston know that. Okay? But when they go to vote, when they went to vote in the last election, they saw Sylvester Turner's name on the ballot, but they didn't see Democrat or Democratic Party. You understand what I'm saying? Okay. On the other hand, when you go to vote in the governor's election in November of this year, and you see Greg Abbott's name on the ballot, because he'll likely be the Republican Party nominee, you'll see Republican Party Greg Abbott. And if Beto O'Rourke is the Democratic Party nominee, you'll see Democratic Party Beto O'Rourke for the office of governor. Okay? So those are partisan elections, party-based elections. So let's talk for a bit about what happens in party-based elections. Partisan elections, you have, is a process that occurs in two phases. Bear with me here for just a second. I got to do the switching. Okay. So party-based elections occur in two phases. Okay. First phase is the primary. The second phase is the general election. And the general election occurs in November. The second Tuesday after the, excuse me, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So that's the election where voters will see a Democratic Party candidate and a Republican Party candidate squaring off against each other. You may have other like Libertarian Party candidates and stuff like that as well, but let's face it, in Texas, it's about Democrats and Republicans. And generally in the United States, that's true. Okay, so if you do go vote in November this year, you vote for governor's office, you're going to see a Democratic candidate and a Republican candidate, and that's going to be identified on the ballot as such. And that is the election that determines who the next governor is going to be. So what does the primary do? Primary, it determines who the nominee is going to be of the Democratic Party and who the not. So you might start with a field of candidates, right? Maybe as many as 5, 6 candidates for governor, something like that, who are Democrats who say they want to be the next governor, right? Or a number of candidates, Republican candidates, say that they want to be the next governor. By the way, there is more than one Republican candidate on the ballot in the Republican primary this year. I think it's very likely that Greg Abbott will be the nominee. I don't think there's much suspense there. And it seems equally as likely that Beto O'Rourke will be the Democratic nominee. But let's not call it before the voters have their chance to say, okay? At any rate, it's a process that the parties go through to narrow down a field of, say, 3 or 4 or 5 candidates, how many ever it is, to one, to run in the general election. And I'm very deliberate about using the noun, primary. A lot of textbooks and a lot of people in the media will use that word primary as an adjective. They'll say primary elections. I'm very resistant to using that terminology. I just say the primary. I worry about saying primary elections because I worry that it leaves the impression that somebody is elected to office as a result of the voting. The primary has all the trappings of the election, right? It has a campaign, right, where where candidates, raise a lot of money and they go buy television time and radio time and TV time, and they print up yard signs and bumper stickers and billboards and all that kind of stuff, put stuff out on the internet, however it is that they're campaigning. That happens in the primary as well as the general election. You also have voters going in on the appointed day or period of time. In Texas, there's an extended voting period, right? So you have that, voters going into voting booths, polling places, and marking ballots or pulling levers or however the voting machines work, okay? So I do understand why people want to call them elections. Like I said, I worry about, the conclusions that people draw. Like, oh, somebody's been elected to office. No, nobody's been elected to office. They've been nominated to run for an office, okay? And if that sounds like I'm being picky, well, maybe I am, okay? But like I said, I want to be sure that at least you guys understand what the consequences of this versus this. Now, when we talk about all offices that are elected on a party basis, except for the president, okay, we are talking about the use of something called the direct primary. If we're talking about the presidency, then it's a presidential preference primary. So what's the difference between those two? Well, I'm going to try to keep it simple, okay? In a direct primary, voters like you and me go into a voting booth and we cast our ballot for the candidate of choice. The votes are counted up at the end of the voting period, and the candidate who gets a majority of votes, okay, as distinguished from the most votes, okay? What's the minimal requirement for a majority? At least half plus one, okay? So under Texas law, primaries, to get the nomination of the party, it has to be a majority. So let's say you have, just to keep the numbers simple, let's say you have 3 candidates seeking the Democratic Party nomination for governor. And candidate A gets 49%. Candidate B gets, let's say 45%. What are we left with? That's 94%. The candidate C gets 6%. Am I doing the arithmetic correct there? Does that add up to 100? Let's say it does. So who's the nominee of the party? We don't know yet. The point is we don't know yet because nobody satisfied this threshold. And you're right. We have to have a runoff primary between these two. And that happens a lot in Texas. We're talking about the general election here. There's only a plurality requirement. That means the candidate who got the most votes. So if this was the outcome, if you had a Democratic candidate, a Republican candidate, and a Libertarian Party candidate, let's say, and this was the outcome of the vote, who would win? Then it would be A, right? That's an important difference under Texas law as it pertains to primaries versus the general election. There's no requirement for runoffs unless we're talking about city elections. Then there's a runoff requirement. But if we're talking about governor, if we're talking about state representative, if we're talking about Texas Supreme Court justices, if we're talking about district court judges, if we're talking about state senators, if we're talking about county sheriff, if we're talking about county judge, whatever those state and county offices are, it's a majority requirement to get the party's nomination. And in the general election, it's a plurality requirement. Oh, it's so complicated. It's so confusing, right? No, it is. I'm not being, that may have sounded flip. It is, I think, confusing. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much on that point because I don't want to lose this up here. Okay, this distinction between direct primaries and presidential primaries. If we're talking about the presidency, okay, so in a direct primary, all these other offices, when you go vote for Greg Abbott in the primary, you're actually voting for Greg Abbott. And that vote is counted and the votes are tallied up, and whoever gets a majority, probably Greg Abbott, becomes the Republican Party nominee for governor. Okay, or if you vote in the Democratic Party primary, Beto O'Rourke, right? But in presidential primaries, you're not actually voting for the presidential candidate. Any of you vote in 2020? Okay. We're not going to ask you which party's primary you voted in. Okay. I'm just going to assign something to you, and I hope I don't offend you. Okay. I'm using the Democratic Party here because the Democratic Party was an open question. It really wasn't an open question for the Republicans. Trump was the incumbent president, and he was going to be renominated by the Republican Party. So you go vote in the Democratic Party primary, and you see a bunch of names on there. You see Joe Biden, you see Mike Bloomberg, you see Bernie Sanders, you see Pete Buttigieg, you see, who else? There were a bunch of them, right? Do you remember back in 2020, they were like, at one point there was like 15 people on the stage debating each other, right? I mean, there were a bunch of them. So how do you get down from 15 to 1, right? That's the point of the primaries, right? But here, what I'm trying to tell you is if you go to vote in the Democratic Party primary in Texas in March of 2020 and cast your vote for Joe Biden, you're not actually voting for Joe Biden. You're voting for delegates to attend the Democratic Party's national convention who are pledged to Joe Biden. And then when the Democrats hold their national convention in the summer of 2020, those pledged delegates from Texas who are pledged to Joe Biden cast their votes for Joe Biden. And then when Joe Biden gets the required majority, he's the official nominee of the Democratic Party. So it's not a direct process, it's an indirect process, right? We're actually voting for delegates rather than the candidate himself. So that's why I'm making this distinction. If we have time, and I don't think we will, but if we have time, we'll come back and pursue that a little bit more. You got to get some of this other stuff out here. So for the most part, we're talking about the use of the direct primary. What's the direct primary again? You go vote for your candidate of choice. That is tallied in with all the other votes, and the candidate who gets the majority is the party's nominee. So we generally know on the night of the primary, when the votes are counted, or at least the night of the runoff primary, who the party's nominee is going to be going into the general election. Unlike in presidential politics, where the whole thing takes months, because not all states hold their primaries on the same date. All right, having said all that, okay, now let me give you a little history of the primary, particularly the direct primary. The first direct primary was used in this country in, I think, 1914. Let's see if I have this somewhere. This is about the best I can do for you. Oh, wait. Do I have? Okay, so the first direct primary was used, I think, around 1914 in Wisconsin. It was a product of the progressive reform movement. It was an innovation of the progressive reform movement. How many of you have taken the second American history course? Just a quick show of hands. Have you taken the U.S. history course, like the second one? Do they still have a unit on the progressive reform movement? Anybody have any memory of that? I hope so. Okay, it was pretty important. One of the things that they probably emphasize in that history course, does anybody remember what the progressives were doing? What was sort of their thing? What were they? By the way, you had progressives in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. What generally were progressives interested in? I'll give you a hint. This is the period where Congress passes, in some states, pass a lot of this antitrust legislation. Remember learning about the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Wheeler-Leah Act and the Clayton Act and all that? Okay. What do we mean by antitrust legislation? What are antitrust laws? Kristen? Exactly. Okay. The basic idea of antitrust legislation is to either prevent the formation of monopolies or to break up monopolies if they form. Okay. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the thing that we credit the progressives with is their efforts to eliminate monopoly. Okay. They hated monopoly power. They hated monopoly power. But they didn't just hate, by the way, what's the problem with monopolies? Like if we're talking about in economics, what's the problem with monopoly? Why would progressives detest them so much?
One entity can like control an aspect of like
What is it
production or something.
what side of the market are we talking about? The supply side or the demand side? Are we talking about when we say monopoly, are we talking about one supplier supplying the market? Or are we talking about one demander demanding whatever the market is supplying? We're talking about the supply side of the market, right? So we're talking about one business, to be a little bit more everyday language. One business is the only business that provides this good to the market or this service to the market. Okay, so what? What's the problem with that? It's all about monopoly pricing power, right? That is to say that we generally have this idea that monopoly is bad because the monopolist is a price setter, and as a profit maximizer will set the price at a level that's higher than what the market would bear if there was actually competition in the market. So what the progressives are saying is we want competition in the market because competition is what governs prices. Right? If you only have one supplier, then that's bad for consumers because, or farmers, or whoever their population of interest is, it's bad for them because that means prices are a lot higher. Well, this isn't an economics course. I'm trying to get you thinking along the lines of what the progressives were about. They despise monopoly power. Not just economic monopoly power, they also despise political political power. And so that meant that they had some reforms in mind for the political system, because this was also the era of boss politics. Maybe you remember learning about that in your American history course, where particularly in large cities like New York, for example, they had these party machines run by party bosses. No? Doesn't ring a bell for anyone? No? Yes? A couple of people? All right. So typically what the party bosses did was they sort of controlled things and kept people loyal to them through a number of mechanisms, one of which was the control over the nomination process. So if you wanted to run for, say, a state house seat, okay, you had to demonstrate your homage to the party boss because the party boss really controlled whether or not you could get that nomination of the party. The progressives come along. Well, we can't have that. We can't have party bosses running things. Right? They want to democratize the process, okay? Lowercase d. In other words, they want to take control of the nomination process out of the hands of party bosses, party elites, and put it in the hands of rank and file members of the party. So the primary means that ordinary voters, ordinary rank and file party members get to determine who the party's nominee is. And their votes are counted at the end of the voting period, and that's what determines who the party's nominee is going to be, not some decision of a party boss. Okay? So they're trying to break up political monopoly power. And the mechanism here that they see to do it is this innovation called the direct primary. Does that make sense? Good. I said that the first direct primary was somewhere around 1914, I think. I'm not going to bet my next paycheck on that, but that seems about right to me, right? But by the 1930s, it was being used in virtually every state in the country. That's how quickly the idea caught on. Like it just really became a very popular idea in both political parties, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So that today, with very few exceptions, that's the way the Democratic Party nominates its candidates. That's the way the Republican Party nominates its candidates, is through the direct primary. Minor parties have some options. Okay, it's governed by state law. Okay, so it varies from state to state. But whether you're in California or Texas or New York or whatever, you can bet that if you're talking about the Democratic Party's candidate for governor or the Republican Party's candidate for state legislative office or whatever, they were nominated through a direct primary. Now, in addition to that, let me suggest to you that there are several different types of primaries. Okay? And actually, this would apply to presidential preference primaries as well. Okay. The three basic types that are usually distinguished are the closed primary, the open primary, and blanket primary. Oh, I have it here it's on the screen. Okay. So let me try to distinguish between those as quickly as possible because we're running out of time pretty quickly. In a closed primary, I tell you what, the distinction between open and closed is really the key distinction. So let me put it out there in the form of a question. Open to whom? Or if you prefer, closed to whom?
Closed primaries are like only people who have like declared their affiliation with the political party can vote in that.
That's really pretty good. Okay, that's very good. In fact, much more precise than I was going to put it, although I would have eventually gotten to that point. The basic idea is that the closed primary is closed to anyone who's not a member of the party. The closed primary is open. Closed primary is only open to party members. Do you remember from the reading material whether the closed primary or the open primary is more common? Like if we, the number of states that have closed primaries versus the number of states that have open primaries. Which one more states have which one? Closed primary is more common. Okay. Now, you may also remember the authors of your textbook tell you that under Texas law, in fact, you just took a quiz that had a question to this effect, right? Under Texas law, the Texas primary is a closed primary, but the authors of your textbook tell you that in practice, it's an open primary. Right? You got that one right on the quiz? Okay, good. They're wrong. The authors of your textbook are wrong. Okay? Now, I don't say that very often, but they're just wrong. It is a closed primary. I'm going to try to explain to you why I say they're wrong. Yes, sir. Yes.
So the answer was closed?
No, the answer, because it was based on the reading material, should have been true, right? Because that's what the authors of your textbook tell you. That state law says it's closed, but in practice, it's an open primary. So if you answered true to that, I think that's the way it was worded, right? Yeah, if you answered true, you got it right. Because, again, that was quizzing you over the reading material. But here's why I'm suggesting to you that the authors of your textbook are wrong, okay? I shouldn't say it quite so emphatically. What are the requirements of a closed primary? What are the sort of the elements of a closed primary? Well, you mentioned one of them, right? You have to declare a party affiliation. Okay. Voter declares a party affiliation. Now, in some states, that's done at the time that you register to vote. For example, I lived in Arizona when I was in graduate school at the University of Arizona in Tucson, and it may have changed. That was a long time ago. But back in those days, when you registered to vote in Arizona, you fill out the form, there's a place where you put in party affiliation. And let's say, just for laughs, as a hypothetical, when I filled out my voter registration application in Arizona, I put, under party identification, I put party A. Primary day comes, and I show up say I want to vote in the primary for party B. What are they going to say to me? You can't vote here. It says right here on your voter registration card that you're a member of party A. Go vote in party A. It's closed to me. Okay? Other states, like Texas, don't require, anybody in here ever voted? You registered to vote? When you registered to vote, did you declare a party affiliation? You're not required to do that in Texas. Not at the time that you register to vote. But when you go vote, nobody admitted that they voted. So I'm going to just tell you what's going to happen. If you go vote in this primary that voting is already open, right? Okay. So if you go vote, let's say in the Republican Party primary, or your intention is to go vote in the Republican Party, or it doesn't matter, you vote in one of the two party primaries, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to go up to the counter and they're going to ask you a question. Want to guess what question they ask you? Which party's primary do you want to vote in? And you say Republican. Right? And anybody who's in earshot can hear you say that and know that you're about to mark a Republican Party ballot. You are declaring a party affiliation. Now, let's say you cast that Republican Party ballot where you vote for Greg Abbott and other Republican candidates. And then you go back to the line and you say, now I want to vote in the Democratic Party primary. What do you think they're going to tell you? Get out of here. You already voted in the Republican Party primary. You can't vote in both parties' primaries. And that's the second thing. You can't vote in both. That makes Texas a closed primary state. Even though it may not be as closed as Arizona, as I described Arizona to you, or some other states. So maybe we'll call it a quasi, sort of closed primary. Seen that word before, right? Quasi, sort of closed. Here's one reason that it's kind of a soft requirement, right? Well, first of all, the requirement to declare a party ID is pretty informal, but I mean, would you agree with me that you're still declaring a party affiliation? Like you go say, I want to vote in the Democratic Party primary. And they say, which party's primary do you want to vote in? And you say, oh, Democratic. And everybody, I didn't know he's a Democrat. Oh, just keep my kids away from him. Oh, you might be surprised. Right? They're not supposed to say things like that in polling places. At any rate, this part is pretty soft because even though in 2022 you can only vote in one of the two parties, like say you vote in the Democratic Party primary in 2022, nothing's stopping you from voting in the Republican Party primary in 2024. And then nothing's stopping you from switching back to the Democratic Party in 2026. And then back to the Republican Party in 2028. It's a little bit more difficult in a state like Arizona, at least the way I described Arizona to you, because you would have to re-register each time, right? Now, in an open primary, there's no requirement to declare a party affiliation. You can still only vote in one of the two party primaries, but you don't have to declare a party affiliation. So I've never lived in a state that has an open primary. So I'm only speculating about how they would carry that out as a matter of practice. But I suspect that what would happen is that voters would be presented with the ballots for both parties, but they could only mark one of them. But no one would know which one they're marking. And then a blanket primary, did they give you that one in the textbook? You remember reading about a blanket primary? There's only been a few states historically that have had it, and I think today there may only be one or maybe two. I think California and Oregon might have kind of a variation of the blanket primary. The basic idea of a blanket primary, it's an independent voter's dream come true, because the voter can go in one voting exercise and they can vote for Democratic candidates and Republican Party candidates. They can vote for Democratic candidates for governor, or Republican candidate for state representative. You know, that's what independents like to do. They like to pretend that they're voting for the person and not the party. which we all know is rubbish. I vote for the person, not the party. I study the candidates and the issues, and I know what they're like. Yeah, sure you do. I wonder if you were asked one of these voters who so proudly proclaim their independence and how they're such great citizens, civic minded, and they study the candidates, not the issues. I wonder if you were to ask them, hey, what are the duties of a Texas Railroad Commissioner? I wonder if they could tell you. Some of them maybe. Really, do you really know what the qualifications are of the candidate? And how did you come to know that? Because they told you? I know what I'm telling you sounds like heresy. I'm not supposed to say stuff like that. Really, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the admonition that independent-minded voters usually wag their fingers at party voters and say, you know, who would vote for the party? Well, there's some logic to voting for the party and not the person. I mean, we have an incredibly complicated system. And the idea that an individual voter has the time and energy to devote to studying all of the candidates for all of the offices and knowing what their backgrounds are and what their qualifications are and what the issues are and so on, much less what the office does once elected, that's an awesome task. I'm not going to pretend that I do that. But there is some logic to saying, well, if you think of yourself as a Republican, that at least if I vote for Republican candidates, I know I share a basic philosophy with them. And probably a lot of specific issues I would agree with them on, right? Or if you think of yourself as a Democrat, at least I know I share a common philosophy with a Democratic candidate about the kinds of things government ought to be doing or ought not be doing, or even, as I say, specific policies. It doesn't mean that a candidate might throw a curveball at you. Like if you think of yourself as a Democrat, maybe say, well, if I vote for Democrats, I'm more likely to get candidates who are pro-choice on the abortion issue. Well, there is a such thing as a Democratic candidate every once in a while who is pro-life. So it's not foolproof, right? I mean, there is a chance that you vote for somebody who you wouldn't have voted for otherwise. Anyway, the blanket primary is an independent voter's dream come true. But as I said, it's not used by very many states. Historically, it hasn't been used by. California, I think, uses a kind of a variation of it where all of the Democratic candidates and all the Republican candidates for an office are on the same ballot. And then, regardless of whether they're Democrats or Republicans, the top two vote getters. Let's say you have, out of all the Democrats and all the Republicans who say they want to be the next governor of California, let's say you have 12 candidates on the ballot. Very unlikely that any of those are going to get a majority, right? So they're going to have a runoff, right? And, well, excuse me, it wouldn't be technically true to think about it as a runoff. They have a system where the top two vote getters in the primary, regardless of their party affiliation, are going to face off in the general election. It's possible you could get two Democrats facing off against each other in the general election, or two Republicans facing off against each other. It's called, I think they call it a top two system, a top two tier system or something like that. And then there are other places that have what they call rank order voting, where voters rank the candidates in preference. Oh, this is my first preference, this is my second preference, this is my third preference. And then there's some sort of pointing system awarded based on how many first place votes you get, how many second place votes a candidate gets, et cetera. I think New York City tried that in their most recent election. I think, if I remember right. Anyway, we're out of time. We're going to have to call it a session at that, and unfortunately we didn't get to some of the other details, but hopefully you got a little bit better sense of how these electoral processes work. Okay, have a good week. We'll see you on Thursday next week.